Author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
The war in Israel appears to have drawn battle lines among those who once saw themselves as friends and neighbors. Or has it? And is it possible that all this conflict has done is pull back the veil on deeply held beliefs that existed all along and has ultimately made a mockery of the idea of shared values? Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to take a moment to say a brief thank you to our listeners out in Pasco, Washington on KONA 610 AM. We appreciate you. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Are we witnessing a world given over to blind hatred of Jews as it was 100 years ago? Well, that's the very question asked in a recent article on LibertyNation.com by our first guest this week, Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner, who joins us now. Welcome back to the show, Tim.
Thank you, Mark. Good to be here.
So, Tim, you wrote a fascinating piece that it seems to me asks questions that other news outlets, I don't know, maybe they seem too afraid to ask, or as if giving voice to such a question will give that question strength. And you asked that in the wake of the Hamas attacks and the worldwide spread of pro-Palestinian and, let's be honest, pro-Hamas rallies and mobs, whether we might be seeing a return to 1930s Germany mentality. What's the answer to that, in your opinion, Tim?
Well, I think it's frightening enough that we even have to ask the question, that the question is even valid, but it is. Are we seeing the 1930s all over again? Well, we're seeing an anti-Semitic wave rising across the world. We're seeing it in the United States on college campuses where one Jewish student after another says they're literally afraid to be on campus. We see it with vicious protests, even in places with large Jewish populations like New York. You see the excuse making for Hamas that they're an occupied people and therefore they have a right to defy the occupation of the Israelis. But I think that bad enough to ask the question about whether it's the 1930s all over again. The problem is that you cannot answer in the negative with any confidence, because what we're seeing now is exactly what we saw rising in the 1930s when a megalomaniacal dictator in Germany started concentration camps for those who he felt did not fit the mold of the world going forward, dominated by the Aryan race. We are seeing frightening similarities to the 1930s. And I'd like to think the answer is, well, Mark, this is pretty bad, but I think it can be contained. I don't see it being contained because it's across the world. It is about deeply embedded hatred for Jews that goes back to biblical times. But if you just want to look at the last 100 years, to see what's happening now has to be particularly chilling to anybody who lived through the 1930s and were witness to what American soldiers saw when they liberated concentration camps in Germany after the war. They were beset with horror and disbelief at what they saw. And what we saw in northern Israel and in southern Israel, really all through Israel now, the type of inhumane brutality, beheading children, setting entire houses and families on fire, sticking children in ovens. Okay, this stuff is all reminiscent of the 1930s and 40s as Germany and the Nazis began their march on the rest of Europe. So I wish I could say, no, Mark, this is not similar, but it is chillingly similar.
You know, that Professor Jordan Peterson, he, and I hope I'm not mischaracterizing what he says here, but I believe he spent a large portion of his life and career trying to understand how people can get involved in an evil movement like the Nazis in 1930s, and how we we say we would never be in that kind of thing. We're too morally advanced, and yet I look around the world today and I think, well, maybe he's got a point, that we're kidding ourselves if we think we're beyond that kind of stuff. Now you highlight that, and this is a very interesting point, I think, that formerly respectable news outlets appear in a hurry to publish nonsense that makes the Israeli side look bad, but are hesitant to label Hamas as anything other than freedom fighters. And take, for example, the hospital bombing, with 500 dead, apparently 500 dead. The places like the New York Times blamed on the IDF, and based on, and here's the very telling point, based on reports from Hamas. And I'll let that little nugget settle for a moment. As we know,
right, they did it based, their reporting was based on essentially news releases from the terrorists who had slaughtered hundreds of innocents. Actually, 1,300 was a total number at that time, in the most barbaric kind of fashion. And the New York Times, the Pied Piper for all media on the left, rushed out with a report that the Israelis had fired on this Gaza hospital. And what they did was they set loose the kind of undiluted anti-Semitism that we see rising, not just in the Middle East and not just among Muslims, but here in the United States, among naive, gullible kids who are being led down the primrose path by neo-Marxist professors on college campuses who are taking the side of Hamas, and let's say Hamas, not the Palestinians. They try to drape their sympathy for this attack on being pro-Palestinian. But I can tell you that Palestinians are humans too, and they don't support broadly what Hamas has done. They don't support this kind of savagery. So at the same time, I will say that even if the New York Times hadn't been so anxious to immediately blame Israel for that hospital bombing, which turned out to be patently false, probably a misfire from Islamic Jihad from within Gaza was what we found out. But if they hadn't misfired on that story, as that missile had misfired on the hospital, the left and Hamas and the pro-terrorist sentiment around the world would have found something else to find as an outrage. So you can't simply blame the media, but they made it so easy. But I thought the New York Times, I'll tell you what, when I was growing up, Mark, reading the New York Times, I always thought of them as being distinctly pro-Israel. Not anymore. Not anymore.
That brings us to politics very clearly, I think, and it's almost exclusively on the progressive left who are holding the rallies outside Capitol Hill, for example, in favor of Palestine, which really in this case is in favor of Hamas in many ways. At that point it was certainly but you have squad members, and I think this is an important point, who have towed the line for every single Joe Biden policy and proclamation since he came to office without saying a single word against him. And yet on this particular issue, the Jews fighting for their existence in Israel, these politicos, they're willing to go head to head with their own president and say they and their constituents won't support him for re-election unless he bows to their demands. Now, this seems to me that that's a hatred beyond politics.
Well, it is, because it's a deeply, again, the squad tries to parse their hatred of Jews by saying they're just anti-Israel. They're anti-Zionist, so to speak, but they're not against Jewish people per se. But I think if you look at these protest demonstrations, like the one at that Russian airport where a mob of Muslims tried to descend on Jews getting off a plane from Israel, you can see it goes far deeper than just opposing the political settlement that created Israel. I mean, they're trying to gaslight us. This is the most classic case of gaslighting I've ever seen, Mark, where they're trying to say what we didn't see, what we saw, we didn't really see. The savagery really didn't happen. These are people, Mark, many of whom deny that the Holocaust even happened. There's many that say it was exaggerated, but there's a solid number of people within this pro-Hamas community, shall we say, who believe that the Holocaust was not just exaggerated, but actually never happened. And the reams of photographic evidence of the savagery was all what created out of whole cloth, right? This is how evil and insane and out of touch with reality the Islamist movement writ large is across the world. And when I say Islamist, I mean Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, and all the other organizations who may have internal disputes between themselves, but all agree on one thing, that Israel needs to be wiped off the face of the earth.
And we'll be back with Tim Donner after this short break discussing the political implications of what he's just been saying. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and longtime host of this here show, Mr. Tim Donner. Now, earlier we talked about the growing acceptability in media and politics of positions that would have, in recent years, been considered a little beyond the pale. But now I want to really drill down into political ramifications. Now, Tim, if you'll forgive me the extended explanation that I'm about to give, because there's a couple of data points I'd really like to drill down. And I think these are significant when it comes to the Muslim community in America and their support of Democrats, and specifically Joe Biden. First, there was a poll done for Arab Americans this last week, and it says that only 17% now support Joe Biden. That's down from 59% in 2020. That's 17%. Now, this
from 59 to 17.
Exactly.
Wow.
And this is in mostly battleground states. And this is a rejection of his stance towards Israel. Now, this poll, it was commissioned by the Arab American Institute. So that's data point one. Point two is that also this last week, the National Muslim American Democratic Council, I think I've got that right, they issued an ultimatum to Joe Biden that he should use his power to call for a ceasefire immediately by close of business on November 1st, or they would... I'll quote you what they said, actually. They pledged to mobilize, quote, Muslim, Arab, and allied voters to withhold endorsement, support, or votes from any candidate who endorses the offensive against the Palestinian people. And they speak to the president directly, saying, your administration's unconditional support, encompassing funding and armaments, has played a significant role in perpetuating the violence that is causing civilian casualties and has eroded trust in voters who previously put their faith in you. Now, more than 1 million Muslim voters voted in 2020, the majority for Joe Biden, and the majority of those in swing states. So, Tim, sorry for going on so long, but I think the poll, it does not, one poll does not a summer make, to use the phrase, but backed up with that message from the National Muslim Democratic Council, of which there are lawmakers, Democratic Party leaders in there. I think that spells disaster for Joe Biden, doesn't it?
Well, it certainly does, because it puts him between a rock and a hard place. He has come down solidly, 100% on the side of Israel in this. And that has inflamed tensions among Arab Americans, as you've said. And there's no way for him to settle this, right? He can't suddenly abandon Israel, because if he did, he would basically be abandoning a lot of the general election voters. But because he has pitched his tent in a pro-Israeli position, he's now going to be abandoned by enough people, it seems to me, on the far left, who will at best not vote, or at worst vote for, say, Cornel West, or vote for a no labels candidate, or vote for Robert F. Kennedy Jr., or, God forbid, even vote for Donald Trump, right?
Well, yeah, Arab
No,
Americans,
I think
30% where it went for Trump, I think.
I'm going to do a piece on this for LibertyNation.com, Mark, but basically, I think that the Israel war is Joe Biden's pandemic.
Mm.
And what I mean is, Donald Trump couldn't win for losing with the pandemic. Everything he tried, half the people at least objected to it. They didn't know what to do. Nobody knew what to do. He couldn't win for losing. Joe Biden stood on the sidelines and attacked Trump as being responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths. Okay. Well, the worm has turned because there is no way for Joe Biden to satisfy enough of the electorate not to pay a steep price. And I will localize it. Mark, Michigan, which is a vital swing state, won by Trump in 2016, won by Biden in 2020. Michigan is replete with Arab Americans. It's a heavily Arabic state. It has the highest, I believe, Lebanese population in the country. So just that state alone puts Joe Biden into immediate electoral peril. And it's not something he can really do anything about, just like Trump with the pandemic.
Yeah, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, these places all have large Arab American or Muslim populations. This National Muslim Democratic Council, they aren't Palestinians, or presumably not all of them. They're Americans who live alongside and share neighborhoods with Jewish people. And yet it appears, and I might be wrong here, that they're willing to side with people half a world away because they share a religion. Now, the same goes for
a lot of these people who support them here are not practicing Muslims.
Yeah. So there's supposed to be a shared value that makes a country work. And if that value turns out not to be shared, as in the primacy of their loyalty is to something that's happening half a world away, does that not tear away a veil?
Well, this is, I will put it this way. It used to be when conservatives and liberals had differences, they both agreed that the goal was to strengthen the country and make it stronger. I don't think you can say that anymore because the left of the Democratic Party no longer believes in the same America that we all agreed on many years ago. And when we reach that point where we don't have shared values anymore, that's when we're in really deep trouble.
Deep trouble indeed. Tim Donner, thanks ever so much for being here.
My pleasure, Mark.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Houthis in Yemen have joined the fight against Israel, expanding the so-called axis of resistance in the region. Now, what does this mean for Israel now that it has aggressors coming from the south? And does it mean that other regional forces are about to get involved? Well, we're very lucky to have with us a person whose bread and butter is to understand such geopolitical maneuvers, retired Air Force pilot and former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Controller, Mr. Dave Patterson. Thanks for being here, Dave.
Thank you, Mark.
So tell me, the Houthis in Yemen, they've joined the fight now. So how difficult is it for Israel to defend? Because this is coming from the south, Hezbollah in the north, and then, of course, everything that's happening in Gaza. And has the U.S. joined in that defense?
I think the answer is yes and yes. Yes, the Israelis have the capability to defend against both the ballistic missile that the Houthis have gotten from Iran, as well as their cruise missiles and their drones. And for the first time with this attack from Yemen, the Israelis have used their Arrow air defense system, which will in fact engage Scud-type missiles as they go up in the upper atmosphere. And so it's a very effective weapon system, and apparently it was effective this time as well. And they also scrambled some F-15s to take out the drones. And so you can see why the U.S. military dispatched the THAAD system and more Patriot batteries to the Middle East, because they also have the same capability.
Okay, and did the carrier strike forces in the Mediterranean, what were they doing while the Arrow system was taking down this? It was a medium range missile, wasn't it?
That's correct. Right. And I suspect that, the USS Carney was able to dispatch 15 drones, some of them sent from Yemen, and did it quite effectively, as well as taking out some of the inbound missiles as well.
Okay, just a brief interlude here, Dave. You wrote in a recent article that the Houthi, they were taken off the State Department's terror register, I guess it's called, a terrorist group addendum, by the Biden administration. Now, first question on that, what were they thinking? And second question on that, what were they thinking?
Well, I think that from my perspective, if you can answer that question, you'll be the only one, because who knows? It goes to the very core of their philosophical approach to geopolitics. And it can be summed up saying, if we're real nice to you, will you be real nice to us? And that is just total hogwash. It has never worked in the history of man-on-man warfare. It just doesn't work. It's just downright silly. And yet they hold tenaciously to this concept.
And I'm not sure about this. Is Hamas in the same position?
No, Hamas is, at least they got that right. Hamas is a terrorist organization, and they didn't take Hamas off of the terrorist list.
And Hezbollah?
Hezbollah is also on the list.
Okay. So two out of three ain't bad, to quote Meatloaf.
Right.
Now, Dave, I guess we have to, the thing to consider here is this so-called axis of resistance. Now, to me, that seems a very, very Western word, a Western sentence, and it perhaps speaks to how much Westernized support there is for this axis of resistance, that this is being used. But can you tell me a little bit more about what it is?
So what they have done, and I believe it was coined, within Iran, and it's worked very well because it's something that, the crackerjack intellects on our college campuses can grasp. And that was what it was designed for, apparently.
Yeah.
It's not a concept that the Islamic world would naturally gravitate toward. But the Western world, they get that. And because it plays
it's using two key things, isn't it? The axis, we have the Axis powers.
Right.
And resistance, well, that's social justice, and it's a ready-made sloganized name, isn't it?
Yes, it is, and and as I said, it's a very Western concept, and obviously it resonates with the brain trusts we have on our college campuses and other places as well.
So, with this axis of resistance, which presumably include Hamas, Hezbollah, and by extension Lebanon, Houthi, and by extension Yemen, because they're not doing much to stop these terrorist organizations within their midst. Who else is likely to join this particular axis?
Well, I think you're going to have the head nods, obviously, out of China and North Korea and Russia, and so you've got basically the four bad actors in the world who are jumping they are jumping on this bandwagon, and I think but Mark, that's to be expected. I mean, in the U.S. National Defense Strategy, they identified these people as bad actors. Every national intelligence estimate identifies these people as bad actors. And so we're surprised that they're bad actors.
Yeah, it kind of brings us to why this is even happening, not why the conflict is happening, but why other people are getting involved. Because we've seen, so the action, let me build this case here. The action in Yemen, I think perhaps it will embolden other actors, state actors or terrorist group actors in the region to get involved, because we've had both President Biden and Vice President Harris firmly warn others from getting involved. Don't was the very stern and apparently serious delivery that Joe Biden gave, saying don't get involved. There was threat inherent in that single word use, don't get involved. And, you know, we're supposed to take them as serious people, and yet straight away, Hezbollah out of Lebanon, they join the fight. And now you've got Houthis out of Yemen, they're joining the fight. And it seems that no one at all believes that Joe Biden will do anything to back up his words. Now, there's a very, very good case for saying, well, thank goodness for that, because that's pushing us closer to a global conflict. But isn't this a fatal weakness that everyone seems to regard Joe Biden's red lines as they can be eminently ignored? And won't that encourage other people to get involved because others have ignored his red lines and nothing's happened?
No, I think you're exactly right. I mean, in order to be taken seriously, you have to say things that are serious, and then you have to follow them up. And contrast, you know, what the Biden administration is not doing with the Reagan administration. When in October of 1987, Reagan started or executed a Operation Nimble Archer, in which he had the U.S. Navy in the Arabian Gulf destroy the Rashadat oil platform and the people who were around it. And he did that in response to Iran's missile attack on a reflagged Kuwait oil tanker that was at anchor off Kuwait. And you know what? There was no more problem with Iran in the Arabian Gulf. And because he acted decisively, he said what he was going to do and he did it. And that's what's really important. I think it's really emblematic of how this Biden administration works. There have been somewhere in the neighborhood of 86 attacks on U.S. military forces in the Gulf region. We have responded 5 times. Boy, that's pretty exciting. I mean, who would believe anyone who was that feckless?
Weak leadership begets weak progress. Dave Patterson, thanks ever so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Mark. Always glad to be with you.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
2 major cases are being heard that could upend the whole 2024 presidential election. And we're joined by Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, the dapper Dan of all things court-related, and host of the fascinating Uprising podcast, Mr. Scott DeCosenza, Esquire, for our signature Talking Liberty segment. Thanks for being here, Scott.
Mark, it's a pleasure. And it's also a pleasure to correct you right off the bat, which is to say that there are more than 2 cases involved. There are 2 that are actually have ongoing courtroom antics, but there are, I think, at least 4 by my count, where the 14th Amendment style challenge to Donald Trump's appearing on a ballot has presented itself in these United States.
Well, let me respond, Counselor. If these 2 cases happen to fall flat, the others will presumably follow suit.
I think everybody wants to get in on, get in on the goodness.
Sure. So we're talking about the 14th Amendment challenges to Donald Trump appearing on the ballot. Now, where are these taking place?
Well, the principal one that we're discussing, I think, is Colorado. That's where the most of the fireworks have occurred.
Okay, and the second one will be launching we're recording on Wednesday, November the 1st. We'll be launching on Thursday, November the 2nd, where?
In Minnesota.
Okay. And so both of these allege that because Donald Trump made, I presume that he made a speech, the speech that he made on January 6th, they saw that as an incitement to
Mark,
insurrection.
they say that the Constitution requires that Donald Trump cannot be on the state ballot where people are allowed to choose who they want for president of the United States because Section 3 of the 14th Amendment prohibits his appearance thereof because it says no person, the operable clause as far as they're concerned is that no person who, having previously taken an oath as an officer of the United States to support the Constitution of the United States shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. No person who meets those qualifications can be a senator, representative, or elector of president or vice president or hold any office under the United States. So that's the 14th Amendment, Section 3, and they claim that because of Donald Trump's behavior, especially, I think maybe exclusively on January the 6th, although maybe there's some wiggle room there about whether or not there was some behavior in the lead up to January 6th, but that made him an insurrectionist and therefore ineligible.
Okay, two questions immediately, or 2 points, I guess, spring to mind straight off. The first one is if he were to lose these 2 cases, that means that he's not on the ballot in Colorado nor Minnesota. And assuming that getting write-in votes of a substantial enough amount is virtually impossible, that means that he wouldn't be able to get the electoral college votes to win the election. So that is essentially an election ender for Donald Trump.
Yeah,
correct?
and so just to put it out there, and so people don't misunderstand. So practically speaking, if he loses either of those cases, these are going to the federal courts and will arrive at the Supreme Court, who will have to decide whether or not these people can keep Donald Trump off the ballot. That's it won't end with these particular proceedings, but if the Supreme Court says it's okay, then these judgments will hold. And that's exactly right. Donald Trump will be off the ballot in states where he needs to be on the ballot, and he will almost certainly suffer a loss as president because of it. And then, of course, Mark.
And unless he has a Reagan-esque full sweep, right?
Well, I suppose that's possible. I don't know that the polls suggest that that's, something we're going to see. But in any case, and Mark, there's another thing that just doesn't seem to be in popular discussion, but I think it is important to mention it is, what the people of this country are going to do if through novel applications of provisions that were never designed to, be implemented in this fashion or against these sorts of candidates, what results in this country. It's
it's tempting far too much fate in terms of saying who can, who can't complain about an election. I wonder how far just that would stretch. Now, realistically, Scott, you are a constitutional lawyer. This is what you do. You're a constitutional lawyer. Does the case hold water, to borrow my cousin Vinny phrase?
The Constitution is not this thing that's so. The reason why there are lawyers who disagree on what the Constitution means with what it says is because it's not all tied up into a neat bow. I think that the clear answer is absolutely not. Donald Trump is not. I don't want to speak in double or triple negatives. So let me say this: I think that the Constitution does not forbid or make Donald Trump ineligible for running for office, unless there's some finding by a court that he did engage in an insurrection. Now, it's not like we have a criminal conviction where, he was convicted of some crime of insurrection that they can then rely on to say he's an insurrectionist. But we don't even have any lesser civil declaration of his, acts as an insurrectionist. And the evidence produced at trial so far, I can't understand how that any trier of fact could look at those facts, and even if you take all the testimony presented by the opposing side as valid without challenge. They have an expert who says that far-right extremists heard messaging and interpreted messaging from Donald Trump to engage in violence. But that doesn't have anything to do with whether Donald Trump intended to produce a violent reaction, which is what would be required, Mark, for a criminal conviction. So it doesn't really matter. If you and I are having this conversation now and some wingnuts somewhere take it as a call to engage in some violence, that has no bearing on us because we intend no call. And we're allowed to have a conversation and say things without worrying about what, some whack job is going to interpret it as. And Donald Trump has those same free speech rights, for sure.
I was watching part of the Colorado trial, and it's very interesting that Representative Eric Swalwell of Fang Fang fame made an appearance via video. And one of the lawyers was questioning him. And it turns out that he's involved in a lawsuit that I believe is out of Washington, D.C., seeking damages against Donald Trump for January 6th. And the lawyer questions him and says, would this involve financial payouts? And yes, obviously, Mr. Swalwell is a lawyer. And the lawyer asked him,
if he wins his case, Trump will have to write him a check, is basically what we're saying.
Yeah. And so Swalwell's testimony in this case, he says, do you recognize as a lawyer that your chance of getting a payout, I'm paraphrasing, your chance of getting a payout in that case are higher if you can convince people in this case? And that to me seems like a bit of that's almost a disqualifying argument for being a reliable witness, isn't it?
Given Mr. Swalwell's history, I find it difficult to discuss his goings on with some sort of detachment. It's preposterous, Mark. He's as much a political actor as anybody in the world. And the idea that this is somehow, he's just out for, he's just a dispassionate advocate for law and order and wants to make sure that the Constitution is followed. And boy,
get a check
it's
at
just
the end
the application of the law to the facts, Mark. And that's all we have here. It's preposterous. I went to the website, and I won't give them the credit of naming them, of the group who brought the Colorado lawsuit, and I just decided to check up on them and see what they had going on there. And right when you click on the homepage, the splash funding, will you help us keep Donald Trump off the ballot by sending in your money now? That's the first thing that greets you there. So for them, this is all just like a river of money, as you might imagine. There's no downside. They don't work going to cotton to any Donald Trump policy or backer in any case. And so just really, Mark, a river of money that's going to come their way for their efforts. So I think that's what their motivation is.
Let me just clarify, Scott. That money is for efforts to stop Donald Trump getting off on the ballot. Therefore, it's not classed as a political donation, and therefore has a limit, like an individual might, for electing.
It's so funny, right?
It is.
There's another. Quickly, Mark, I wanted to add that I was at the Ellipse on January 6th reporting for LibertyNation.com and listened to Donald Trump's speech. And I can tell you, I did not hear a call to violence as an ear witness to it.
Well, Scott, that's because you're not one of these right-wing extremists with dog-like hearing that
the whistle.
The case is being made it for. Scott DeCosenza, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mark.
And that's about all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I've been Mark Antolides. I'd like to thank our guests, Tim Donner, Scott DeCosenza, and Dave Patterson for taking the time to join us. And of course, extend my thanks to you, the listeners, for coming in and joining us here on the show each week. My parting shot for today, I'd like to leave you with the words of William Wilberforce, who said, "You may choose to look the other way, but you can never say again that you did not know." Thanks for listening.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at LibertyNation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are LibertyNation.com.